into what can best be described as mindless attackers. Although we have little or no understanding of the illness, it's not the first time we've seen these effects, and the CDC has repeatedly blamed it on xylazine, what's being called the zombie drug, and it's spreading quickly and indiscriminately. It has seemed to spread most frequently in the homeless and drug users, which has given it a perception of being a dirty illness. But more and more, we're seeing regular citizens being infected by this. To help clear up these issues, we have Dr. Megan Tinso on our show to hopefully clear things up. Thanks for coming on, Megan.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So you specialize in infectious diseases, am I correct?
Yes. I specialize in many different kinds of diseases.
Great. So if we get off script here a little bit, you'll be able to answer any of those questions, right?
I can certainly try.
Okay, so my first question is this illness catchy? Can anyone just catch this disease?
At this time, we're not fully sure of how you can contract this illness. We're not quick to call it a disease because we're not completely sure it is one. There have been people who have come into contact with sick people. On a whole, they aren't reporting any signs or symptoms, but we are aware that there are cases where people have been in physical altercations and have developed symptoms and eventually succumbed to the illness.
So the best course of action is to really just stay away from someone you believe is sick, right?
Absolutely. If you think someone is sick, you should avoid them completely and seek shelter. If you do have any kind of physical contact, you should report to your nearest shelter immediately for treatment. Also, if you know someone is sick, you should have them report to the shelter where they can get treatment.
So there is treatment for this?
I'm not aware of the full details of treatment or prevention. They haven't been addressed, but we're told by the CDC that there is a way to slow the effects or prevent them entirely if caught soon enough. These treatments are in short supply, and due to the influx at hospitals, they're only available at the shelters.
So if one doesn't get this treatment, what is the survivability rate?
It's difficult to answer this question. You don't effectively die from the illness in the traditional sense. The effects are unfortunately debilitating. Those who are sick develop high fever, sweats, and eventually their brain succumbs to the illness and they lose all mental faculty. Some people slump over and become motionless, while others lumber from place to place. When they encounter another person, they become violent, and in some cases attempt to eat what they overcome. Once the person has lost their brain function, they will not recover, and it is unknown how long they could live in this condition. Some have suspected 3 days, but if they're able to feed effectively, this time could be prolonged almost indefinitely.
Oh wow, so they are effectively trapped in this state?
Yes, we can only confine them. Hopefully in the future we can find a treatment, or at worst, they'll pass away from the effects of the illness, but there isn't much hope for someone who is infected. What we're trying to determine is what level the damage to the brain has occurred to potentially reverse the effects, but we need to first understand the illness and how it functions, because if we don't, the person could regain conscious control of their body and just slip right back into their prior state.
This illness seems almost nefarious in nature.
Yeah, it's pretty scary.
Do we know where this came from or how it started?
Unfortunately, we don't, and that's something we'd like to do more research on. The first reported cases were in Pennsylvania, but due to the nature of the illness, it's difficult, if not possible, to nail down the source. Some have said it occurred in a more rural area first. It's possible that drug interaction somehow triggered some physiology. The tracking is just not viable in areas like that, and records have been difficult to come by. Add in the perception that police and doctors are not trusted fully, and we have a very difficult time ahead of us trying to find the answers we need.
Can we assume that this was all caused by a drug?
There's been a little confusing on this topic, and I'd like to clear it up. The CDC made an announcement that they were reviewing the drug xylazine. I believe you even brought it up before our interview. What the CDC is doing is based on correlation. Some people reported that the subjects weren't breathing, which is a typical sign of depressed respiration seen in those affected by the drug, known on the street as tranq. These subjects also had skin damage, which is also seen in users of this kind of drug. But the drug itself is only symptomatic of the underlying cause, meaning that someone could have taken something they believed was a drug and it was mixed with tranq. The main effect of getting high became something more sinister, while the secondary effects on the tranq are only perceptible link we could find. It's clear that drug dealers are unscrupulous in what they will give their clients with the title drug on it, and they believe this is truly the cause of the illness. We've seen similar mistakes made in the past where individuals tried to create a new drug looking for a greater high and instead created what we're experiencing. Again, that's just hypothetical based on the evidence and also the locations which we've seen the outbreaks. There have been no cases in places like Boston, for instance, which Trank has never seen a presence.
Okay, I see it. So the truth is we really don't know what we're dealing with.
Yes, at this time we don't fully know what we're dealing with. I believe the goal at this time is to first contain the illness, minimize its effects, and then work both on a cure, which will definitely entail finding a source of the problem before it reaches other areas.
Is there any timeline we can expect?
These events are very dynamic and overreaching. It would be impossible to put an accurate timeline or even hypothesize on what time it will take. We could minimize effects in Georgia quite easily, and the mayor and governor there are taking steps to lock down the city in hopes to control it, while Pennsylvania has seen little action on their part. But I believe it's because their situation is much more involved than in the southern states. I believe the solution will lie in Pennsylvania, but again, that's all conjecture and assumption. I have no solid evidence. The truth is that conjecture is pretty much all we have at the moment.
So, would you say things are going to get worse before they get better?
I'll say this. I'm not an expert on civil defense, but I know those teams are doing their very best to get ahead on this thing. And from the reports that I've heard, they're succeeding. I also know infectious diseases, and though they're able to stop the most destructive parts of these events, I'm not 100% sure we'll ever get rid of it without some sort of inoculation. And the fact of the matter is, if we do get a vaccine, they'll have to force everyone to take it. This is not a frail illness. It's horrible and destructive. By our metrics, it doesn't play nice, which is why it's so important for us to get to the bottom of things as soon as humanly feasible.
Okay, so one thing we discussed before was to avoid people who are ill. Is there any particular signs that we should be looking for?
I'm going to give you some signs and symptoms, but it's important to remember that just because you've seen some signs does not mean you have someone who is ill, so make sure you look for multiple areas. A great sign that we've been using is their inability to respond to commands or speak. The most we've heard is grunts, growls, and moans. The noise seems forced, like they're trying to push the air out of their lungs, and this could be due to the depressed state. People can appear lethargic, as if to shamble instead of walking, but we've seen some with bursts of energy.
You mean they run at you?
I wouldn't say so much as run as controlled falling. The mobility is restricted, but it still functions. Think of it like someone who is drunk trying to run at you. So it's not the most coordinated, but it can happen. For the most part, you would only see that in a young, healthy subject.
Okay, good. So you described some interaction cues. Do they look any different physically?
That's a big concern. Everyone we've seen looks homeless or unkept, which makes it very difficult to differentiate without engaging directly with someone who you believe is sick. But something we're trying to nail down is whitening or reddening of the eyes. We can't seem to disseminate why some people have one and others have the other. It could be some sort of bursting of blood vessels in the eyes, but it's not something that's common. If someone was attacked and was infected, they would be bloodied, show signs of injury. If you see someone that has an injury that you would describe as extremely painful, and at most they're only moaning, you probably have a sick person on your hands.
Okay, I see now why you said to make sure that you have multiple things to look out for. This seems very confusing and difficult to keep up with.
What can make it more troublesome is imagine if you have a loved one that's infected. You're hugging and consoling them, and suddenly they attack you. We've heard multiple times, and it's very distressing to know that a person helping someone is suddenly now infected themselves, and there's little or nothing that can be done to help them.
That's horrible.
That's exactly why it is so important not to harbor anyone that is sick.
I can imagine.
I don't think you're imagining enough. One sick person can attack everyone in a dwelling and infect everyone else. Now they're trapped in a building, ready to infect the next person that comes into contact with them.
Oh my God, that's horrifying.
It's something we saw in hospitals. That nurses and healthcare workers came into contact with sick individuals that were described as fine at first and then had someone attack them moments later. Some workers were bitten or hurt and sent home.
Those people are potentially sick. Were they able to get them back?
I don't know, but we advised them that they need to be tested. It happened all over, and we're trying to get the word out to recall those people to get tested, and hopefully we can get treatments from government organizations. These injuries is why we are already short-staffed.
From what I'm hearing you saying, there is a potential for problematic healthcare here.
You shouldn't be concerned. Once they brought up the shelters to support people and delivered the sick away from the hospitals to minimize the potential for overload in a hospital setting, we're advised private doctors and other healthcare forums on how to advise patients on where to properly go if they are sick. I don't foresee any hospitals having problems at this moment. It may seem like a lot, but with quick mitigation of illness, you'll see the amount of sick people decline and will be a lot more controllable overall.
Sounds to me like the CDC and Civil Defense have at least the direction well under control. Should people be concerned at all?
Being completely transparent, hysteria is never a good thing. In this case, even more so, because even in the short time that this problem has reared its ugly head, the CDC has been able to target the areas that this could have emerged. They have a good general idea of what caused it and already advised on how to slow the spread. The simple thing for people is to not come into contact with a sick person, and then they have nothing to worry about. Even if you do pass someone that is sick, avoiding physical contact is your only real worry. No data has shown that this is airborne or transmissible without direct contact, and there is a potential that the only way to get infected is via contact with blood or saliva. I see little reason that avoidance isn't the cure for this illness, and even in areas where there aren't lockdowns, most people have decided to self-quarantine. So I think we're 75% through this in just over 12 hours since the first report.
I have to admit that prior to this interview, I was worried about what we were up against, and after this short interview with you, I feel much better, and I hope our listeners out there feel the same way. Thank you, Doctor.
My pleasure. I feel it's also important to say that if you're a drug user, it's time to quit.
I think that's great advice. To all our listeners out there, simply put, avoid the sick and you will be fine. Leaving this to the professionals who will already on the job to make sure that you are safe from whatever we're dealing with. Those who are sick, if you have a drug affliction, head to those shelters and get the treatment you need to be better. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I want to thank the doctor for coming in today, and we'll continue our coverage of this event until its conclusion, which we think will be very soon based on the information we have received, and make sure in the meantime to keep you updated. Keep it tuned in.
This is a public service announcement provided by Civil Defense Initiative. If you live within the affected zone, the following emergency information has been provided for your safety. At this time, you are asked to shelter in place. Only leave your premises unless absolutely necessary. Only report to work if you are an essential worker. Emergency response and medical services have been limited to critical care only. Do not contact emergency services or medical facilities unless your condition presents an immediate threat to life. If you are required to leave your premises, it is important to avoid anyone you feel may be sick or does not respond to verbal instructions. Do not engage anyone you are unsure may be sick. Leave the scene immediately. Keep hands washed at all times. Thank you for your attention. Stay tuned to this and emergency channels for further information as it becomes available. This has been an announcement from Civil Defense Initiative.